Okay, hello everyone and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Before I introduce our speakers, I have just a couple housekeeping items. There will be time for Q&A at the end of this webinar. So if you have questions throughout the webinar and during the presentation, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of the Zoom screen. A recording of the webinar and the slides that are being presented today will be available shortly on YouTube and the CCC website. Now I'm pleased to introduce Jesse Schrater and Abhishek Mundra. I'll give it to you guys.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Ashley. Welcome everybody to this webinar hosted by the Confidential Computing Consortium. Today, we're going to be talking about new research into trends in confidential computing and analysis of potential growth in this market. I am Jesse Schrater. I'm from Intel, and I'm here on behalf of the Confidential Computing Consortium, of which Intel is a member. Abhishek is here from Everest. Abhishek, why don't you tell us a little bit about Everest Group and your role there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jesse. Hi, everyone. This is Abhishek. I am practice director with the firm. For those who don't know about Everest Group is a Dallas-based research and advisory firm. And we cater to the technology and the global services market. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. And I just want to take a minute to, for those who may not be familiar, to introduce the concept of confidential computing at a very high level and who the Confidential Computing Consortium is, just so we're grounded in kind of what we're here to talk about today. And then we'll get into the meat of the content about these trends in this market. The Confidential Computing Consortium is made up of really a who's who of technology companies that are contributing in this confidential computing space. Confidential computing is focused on securing data while it's in use, using hardware-based controls. So this is protecting the data and its computation while it's actively being processed in memory, and it's kind of distinguished from data that maybe is being sent over the network or being at rest in storage. The mission of the Confidential Computing Consortium is really to accelerate adoption of trusted execution environments and the various technologies and standards. And members include a range of silicon vendors, cloud service providers, and hardware and software companies as well. And really a big all of these members have really recognized that this is a big growth area for cloud and multi-party compute overall. And so really see security and confidential computing as an enabler for being able to continue data transformation. And so that's what we're here to talk about, and that's what we're here to advocate for. And we've got a great set of content for you guys today. So Abhishek, we talked briefly about what confidential computing is, but maybe you can provide just a little more detail about protecting data in use and how that differs from prior data protection paradigms.
Yeah, sure. So I think over the past decade, a lot of the investments that have been put into security, cybersecurity, has been catering to these two buckets. Which is around protecting data at rest and protecting data in transit. And, this is what I, say together would be called as a prevalent data security model that we know of. As over the last 2 or 3 years, we are seeing a lot of enterprises and technology vendors investing into protecting data while in use, and which creates a holistic data security model. And so if I were to just put a definition around confidential computing, so I would call it as a hardware-based technology which helps in protecting data while you are using the data. Now, and they do it by creating a trusted execution environment. Not going into details of the jargon over here, but essentially what it does is, helps enterprises prevent unauthentic use of data, by the insiders, help cater to some of the malicious network, threats. And not only that, it also enables enterprises to share some of the data which is highly confidential with partners within and outside their organization without actually exposing the data. So these three broad use cases, or three broad categories or reasons, are the key behind protecting data in use.
Okay. And when did confidential computing start appearing on the radar? Where would you say it's at right now in terms of its lifespan?
Yeah. So I think we first started hearing noise around confidential computing back in 2015 and 16, wherein we saw a lot of hardware vendors investing into confidential computing, right? Cut to 2017, we started seeing a lot of investments by the cloud vendors, some of the other software companies that enables confidential computing on top of the cloud infrastructure. We started seeing some of those entering into the ecosystem and doing really cool stuff around confidential computing. It's essentially in the year 2019 and 2020 wherein we have started seeing a lot of investments by the enterprises in POCs, adopting confidential computing in a specific application or a specific set of applications within their enterprise, and looking to scale it up in the years to come. So and this is the as of now scenario. Moving forward in the future, what we expect is some of these enterprises who have already invested into POCs, we expect them to scale these POCs into a full scale use case. We expect a lot more enterprises to start investing into POC. So for example, right now some of our large BFSI and HLS clients, they are running around 8 to 10 POCs in their in their enterprise environment today. We expect these numbers to go up significantly in the near future, for not only for these large enterprises who have already invested, but also new enterprises who are planning to invest into confidential computing.
Okay, great. Well, let's jump straight to the punchline. Everest is projecting that this confidential computing market is going to grow to roughly as much as 52 billion within 5 years, and that's like 100% CAGR, which is pretty amazing. Why don't you walk us a little bit through those high-level numbers?
Yeah, sure. So while 100% CAGR looks very high, especially talking for a 5-year CAGR. But what is essential to understand is, we are starting off with a very low base over here. Confidential computing, adoption by enterprises has only just started scaling up. And over the next 3 or 5 years, we see a significant, potential in enterprises scaling it up further. Now, having said that, this is a best case scenario prediction of the total addressable market. There are a lot of factors at play over here. Things such as what is the level of enterprise awareness that increase over the next 3 or 5 years, which is again dependent on how some of the supply side ecosystem invests into educating their enterprises of confidential computing. So that's one. It also depends on how enterprises ends up adopting cloud. Right now, if you look at cloud adoption per se, right? A typical enterprise would end up having around 20-25% of their workloads on cloud, which is a small number right now. We expect this to increase in future, and a lot of it will also drive the total addressable market for confidential computing. And finally, around the kind of regulatory environment we are in. So I think as these regulations become more stringent and enterprises become more aware about these regulations and take dedicated efforts in meeting some of these, we expect their investment into confidential computing to increase further.
Right, and we should note that, like you're talking about with these different factors, that roughly 52 billion is sort of the most optimistic case, right? And you guys modeled other cases as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, sure. So as I said, 52 billion is a best case scenario. And how does this best case scenario driven? So three key assumptions that we have, over here. The first one is, there is a strong regulatory push, and enterprise has a clarity of where to invest into. And this is not only specific to few enterprise segments, the highly regulated ones, but across the enterprise, across the industries. Secondly, we have assumed here that the vendors will aggressively push the enterprises by educating them about confidential computing, and how confidential computing is not just related to compliance and security, but also it holds a potential to create new use cases and even create new revenue streams for the enterprises. And finally, on the technology maturity per se, right? As we see confidential computing today, it's again, in a nascent stage, but over the years to come, we expect the technology itself to mature, become more affordable for the enterprises to consume. So that's the best case scenario. In a medium case scenario, what we have assumed is, while there will be a regulatory push, the efforts by specific industries, the highly regulated ones, will be higher, and those will be at the forefront of the adoption of confidential computing. So the likes of banking, financial services, institutions, insurance, healthcare, high tech. So these will be the industries where we expect the adoption to drive, and not so much into some of the other industries such as retail or travel. Second is around the awareness of technology, and here we have assumed the awareness of technology is low, and the willingness to invest due to limited proof points by the vendor is the key reason behind, and some of the enterprises not investing into confidential computing. And finally, the worst case scenario is around factoring in various things around how enterprises presume or consumes confidential computing messages from the market. Our different suppliers end up talking about different definitions around confidential computing, different prospects of confidential computing, which ends up making enterprises more confused. And therein we may see that enterprises who are investing into confidential computing will reserve very few applications which they find absolutely necessary to adopt confidential computing, and for the rest of the applications they will probably do a wait and watch to transition them to confidential computing.
Okay, so it sounds like you haven't so much identified a most likely scenario. You have kind of the optimistic case and the most conservative case, and then sort of a middle ground. And we kind of have to wait and see how things play out. But even in the most conservative case, we still see a very significant growth in this market over the next few years.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are some of the most promising usages that you're expecting to see drive adoption?
Yeah. So, as we see on the slide, so if I were to just pick, one or two from these, so the first one will be multi-party computing, right? So as I said earlier, right, confidential computing enables multi-party computing, and it enables a lot of interesting use cases around enterprises using data in a very, very creative manner. right? So multi-party computing is, in fact, one of the biggest use case category, not the biggest, but the fastest growing one that we see in the near future. Some of the enterprises, in industries such as BFSI, healthcare and life sciences and high tech, and also, in industries such as retail, we see some of them to be at the forefront of adoption when it comes to adopting confidential computing for multi-party computing. When within multi-party computing, right, there are multiple use case scenarios. The first one is around private data sharing, which is very straightforward, right? We have talked about how it enables sharing of data, which is highly confidential without actually exposing the data. Some of the other interesting use cases we are seeing is around multi-party analytics, around privacy preserving AI ML modeling. I think those are also some of the interesting ones that is happening under multi-party computing.
Yeah.
I think the next one I would pick is privacy and security. And I think this is the biggest contributor as of today. I think if I recall correctly, it's around 30 to 35% of the overall market contribution. And within privacy and security, a large portion of it is coming in from enabling application security on public cloud, right? So confidential computing, enables applications to run in a very isolated, hardware protected environment, which enables enterprises to run their workloads on public cloud safely. And we expect the rise of confidential computing to also improve cloud adoption by some of the enterprises in regulated industries, because it allays a lot of fear that some of these enterprises have regarding security and regarding hosting their data on public cloud.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot of compelling stuff there, and I know we have a lot more detail about that in your full report. Let's dive now down into a little more detail in how the TAM breaks down. Can you give us a little bit of an understanding of how you segmented the market?
Yeah. So the way we see, on this particular slide, three broad technology segment that we see for confidential computing are the hardware, software, and the services segment. So and again, these hardware, software, and services have certain sub segments highlighted over here. So talking first about the hardware sub segment, right? So the first subsegment within the hardware is around the silicon and the chipset OEMs. And the second one is around the OEMs who are producing these servers, right? And as of today, the overall contribution of both of these subsegments within the hardware bucket is at par with each other. In the years to come, wherein we expect the cloud adoption to scale and the confidential computing adoption by enterprises to scale up, we expect the growth of silicon chipset OEMs to surpass the assembled server OEMs in the near future. So that's about the hardware subsegment. Second, on the software subsegment, and I think herein some of the aspects around how we have defined some of these is very important, right? So for a lot of the industry folks, so they would end up classifying someone like a cloud service provider into a services subsegment. Right over here we have bucketed it under software subsegment, and the rationale is around the software subsegment caters to the entire enablement software and the infrastructure that is enabling confidential computing. So the cloud service providers who are providing infrastructure as a service to enable confidential computing, falls under this bucket. And the way we see in this is, it's the biggest subsegment across all. It is around 83 to 85% of the overall software subsegment. And if we look at it at our overall market level, this is roughly 50 to 60% of the overall market, right? So that's the biggest software subsegment. Second software subsegment is the enablement software. So some of the applications that some of the startups in this ecosystem are developing to enable confidential computing use cases around multi-party computing, blockchain, IoT, edge. All of those companies and then their softwares falls under this particular category. Finally, talking about the services subsegment, this is essentially the services required to implement confidential computing and run confidential computing within the enterprise environment. Again, the services spent can come in from the outsourcing ecosystem, the global system integrators, or it can come in from the in-house services arm of a lot of enterprises. Right now, the way we are seeing it in the market is given, the confidential computing is in the nascent stage. A lot of the enterprises are developing their own, COEs who are, looking after implementation of confidential computing. So they have their own resources who cater to the services aspects. And that's why we see 90 to 92% of the services subsegment is in-house service practices of ISVs. As we move into the future, we expect this to change, and we expect the global system integrators to increase a lot more, because some of these GSIs are the ones who will be educating the market on confidential computing. They will be the one who will enable adoption of confidential computing at a large scale, because right now it's at POC. It's very easy to do it through in-house service practices. But as we see scaling up of confidential computing, we expect the GSIs to contribute significantly higher.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think especially if we look at services, software and hardware, kind of in traditional conceptual buckets, then we really see a pretty large opportunity in all three spaces going forward, right? Different times they kind of shift around, but they're all very significant sized markets.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the provider side, but let's talk now a little bit about the consumption side of this. Who do you project will be using confidential computing as a consumer of the hardware and software and services that we just talked about?
Yeah. So in terms of the end users or the consumption of, or the demand side of confidential computing, as you see on the slide, the biggest contributor are the regulated industries. So the BFSI and healthcare and life sciences, if you see, both of them together today is somewhere around 70% of the overall market, right? And again, this is driven by their need to protect their critical data, because both of these industries have a lot of privacy preserving potential, as we have talked about in this report, wherein there are a lot of applications, a lot of critical data that needs to be protected, not only at rest and in transit, but also while it is in use. So those are the two industries at the forefront of the confidential computing adoption. Then we have the industries such as public sector, right? They are also investing a lot into confidential computing. There is a lot of cloud transformation initiatives that are being undertaken by a lot of public sector enterprises, and therein we are seeing a lot of conversations around confidential computing as well, along with these. And finally, retail and manufacturing, right? Now this is a interesting use case category, or the end consumer category. Over here, specifically in the last 1 year or so, there has been a lot of renewed focus on confidential computing, wherein these guys are investing into making their supply chain more robust. And in order to do that, they seek to improve supply chain visibility and seek to improve collaboration with the other ecosystem partners of theirs. And both of these things are enabled by cloud. And when we are talking about cloud and cloud security, and therein, creates a good use case for confidential computing. So that's a high level perspective on the consumption. I think finally, high tech industry, right? Again, high tech industry is also the one um, which is seeing a lot of traction in the market. Specifically in some of the use case categories around IoT, edge, data and analytics. So those are the key use cases wherein a lot of the telecom service providers are investing into. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I'm noticing a trend here also that early on, especially here in 2021, we do see that heavy weight towards the regulated industries, the financial services, healthcare, public sector. And that makes sense because those are sort of the industries most in need of these kind of data protections just to meet their regulatory requirements and be able to do business. But then I think I see as the years continue, that continues to be a high demand area, but its percentage of the overall market starts to decrease as things like manufacturing and retail and others start to come and play a little bit of a bigger role in leveraging those same capabilities to do things like protect proprietary workloads and compute algorithms. And I think of like in the retail space, the KYC, know your customer type functions with PII data, things like that. There's a lot that go even beyond just those initial set of customers.
Yeah. And there is a lot of business model changes that are happening in these two industries, right? When we talk about retail, there are newer commerce models that are coming up, which again needs a lot of collaboration with other ecosystem partners. So I think, so those are contributing to the adoption in these industries.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's good insight. And I really like that this report, this study has both that provider side and the consumer side, because I think that helps us make a complete picture as to why this market is going in the direction it is, and the opportunities that we can all pursue in this space. So we're kind of coming into the home stretch now as far as our talk today. I do want to get a little bit to sort of a call to action for our audience and enterprises. Just before I do, though, let's remind everybody, if you do have questions for us, maybe that have been rattling around in your head as we're going through these, this is definitely the time to submit them into the Q&A area. If we get some questions in there, we'll try to answer those after we finish. So please feel free to submit that if you'd like to continue the discussion. So Abhishek, then just in kind of closing us out, what should enterprise customers in our audience do to begin stepping into this area?
Yeah. So I think to start off with, enterprises should start exploring confidential computing and learning about confidential computing and its implication in their enterprise environment. I think that's the first and a very crucial step. As enterprises become more aware, and not only aware about the technology per se, but the business case and the business potential that confidential computing has for their enterprise, I think therein they should start making that decision around what are the critical workloads that needs to be there on confidential computing, definitely, and assigning a time frame to it. Right now, okay, 1,000 applications in our landscape, 3% of these we see really critical having, really critical data, and these needs to go on confidential computing today. And now transferring these 30 to confidential computing, and then think about, okay, what is the next slab of application that they can bring onto confidential computing. So that's about the exploration. From an investment standpoint, investment not only is important in the technology per se, but also in the talent who will drive the adoption of confidential computing. Right now, the market is growing exponentially, and the talent in the market is not able to keep up. The growth in the talent is not able to keep up with the growth in the demand. So enterprises should start investing in upskilling their existing employees who are doing cloud security, blockchain in their enterprises today, and upskilling them into technologies which are related to confidential computing. And finally, once they have explored some of the POCs and taken few applications to confidential computing, therein they should start thinking about how do you scale up confidential computing adoption. Because in a lot of our enterprise conversations over the past few months, we have seen a lot of enterprises talking about how confidential computing is really crucial for them, and they even expect 50% of their workloads to operate on confidential computing environment in the long-term future. So that's the kind of scale that some of the very large financial institutions and the healthcare enterprises are thinking of as of today. And the other enterprises should also think in that direction, that what's the future of confidential computing from a scaled perspective in their enterprise.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's definitely still going to be a new concept to many people who are just kind of becoming exposed to it, but it's important to understand that real live, real world production quality solutions do exist today. They're out there. It really does open up new usages that didn't exist previously. And so it's definitely something not just to keep an eye on for some future theoretical possibility, but it really is a present reality that people can investigate and begin to develop towards getting full advantages of. And I think your study here really shows that in very practical terms. So, okay, that's kind of the end of our prepared content. We do want to open it up to questions, and I see a couple coming in, so that's great. I appreciate that. We'll try to get through some of these that are in here. The first question is about how confidential computing copes with GPU requirements. I know I have my own thoughts on that. Does the Everest study address GPUs and kind of hardware specifics?
No. So right now, this study is completely focused on the business side of the confidential computing. What's the business use case? And the study does not go into details of the technology per se. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, but I do know that obviously with the huge demand, especially in the areas around AI, we know that offload accelerators are a big part of needing to keep this data protected while it's in use. And so I think, especially with both hardware and software roadmaps going forward, that, bringing capabilities like GPUs and FPGAs and things like that into the picture is certainly likely to be part of this overall movement, and probably one of many things that will help fuel this this large expansion of the TAM that we'll see over the next 5 years or so. All right. Another question is for organizations moving workloads to the cloud. Can we just talk a little bit about how confidential computing should be considered. What did your study reveal in that space of kind of on-prem workloads wanting to move into the cloud, and how is that likely to shape the market?
Yeah, yeah. So I think both of these things are happening in parallel, right? So when we talk about cloud adoption, so as I said, even cloud adoption today is growing at a really fast pace, and in terms of workloads that are on cloud are very limited. And specifically talking about some of the regulated industries like banking and financial services, right? That number is lower because there are a lot of reservations around moving their workloads to cloud. So as some of these institutions are thinking of their legacy transformation, they are thinking of cloud adoption, and they're thinking how to make their cloud adoption more secure. And therein they are thinking that, okay, here are few workloads that are really critical, and these needs to be on confidential computing. And along with cloud adoption, they are working on POCs for these critical workloads to operate in a confidential computing environment.
Yeah, I agree. I think certainly the need to keep data protected, even as it moves into a public cloud environment where an individual data owner does not have direct control over the servers that are hosting their data. That's certainly a big use case here, right? But I think your study also showed that's just one big and important one, but not the complete picture, right? There's plenty of use cases that even involve on-prem type solutions with multi-party compute, data sharing or compute sharing, even between untrusted parties that could take advantage of the cloud, but also could operate completely in a private cloud or on-prem type scenario as well. So both of those are kind of encompassed in that big tent. All right, so another question is kind of looking at it from the provider perspective, whether we're talking about a CSP or an ISV or a hardware vendor, what are some of the terminologies and kind of concepts that maybe the typical consumer isn't necessarily getting yet, that we should be using in order to help people understand? Are there kind of some common buzzwords or things that really play in this space?
Yeah. So again, anyone who is learning about confidential computing in the first place, they will be bombarded with a lot of these buzzwords around trusted execution environment, blind hypervisor. But then the key thing is not to get bogged down by the the terminologies that are out there, because to be very honest, there are a lot. In fact, definitions of confidential computing, if you get into details of it, there are a lot of definitions floating around in terms of what is considered confidential computing and what is not. But at the end of the day, the enterprises, the way they should think about confidential computing is from a consumption perspective, and thinking critically around the kind of control they would want to have on a specific set of application, and across their application portfolio, the kind of control they would want to execute, and then understanding that, okay, these are the critical applications that needs to be on confidential computing today. So that is important. And therein, we feel in a lot of this education, that we talked about in raising enterprise awareness will be really important. Not from the supply side ecosystem, across service providers, the software providers, and the hardware vendors, wherein they help enterprises realize the business case of transitioning to confidential computing today.
Yeah, I think, I might just add, I think this concept of protecting data in use or in memory, I think that's really a key part of this. We send data over the network in an encrypted fashion, but when it arrives, we decrypt it and we do something with it at that point. And that's really where the focus is. And a lot of people can say, oh, I encrypt my data, but what they're really talking about is when they have it in storage or when they're going across the network. So it is an important thing to understand what's happening with the data while it's actually being processed and it sits in memory. Another thing I think that's important is this concept of not just confidentiality of data in preventing people from being able to read it, but also integrity of the data and preventing people from changing it or knowing if it's been changed. I think that's a sort of a unsung portion of the confidential computing arena is also protecting against manipulation. Manipulation against an algorithm or of a data set that could skew a result and cause some other outcome than what you intended, something running other than what you intended. And so that's a big part of this environment as well. And I know one more buzzword that's been going around a lot these days is this concept of zero trust, right? And of course, true zero trust doesn't really exist in that you don't not trust anything. But the concept, especially with confidential computing, is that we're going to verify first before we trust, right? There's no implicit trust, or we're trying to reduce that trust boundary as far as we possibly can. So there's as few entities, as few system components, and as few people components that we have to trust. And the fewer we have to trust, the less exposure we have. And so those are all big concepts that I know our white papers on the technical side go into a lot more detail on that than, of course, this market study does. All right, I think we're going to wrap up there. This has been a really great discussion, and I appreciate the questions and the audience being attentive through this. I want to remind everybody that you can download the full report. It has a lot more detail. We just went through an overview here, but it really breaks a lot of this stuff down, talks about the methodology, breaks it down into a lot of subcategories. So there's a lot more richness of detail to pull out. And that's available on the Confidential Computing Consortium website, along with white papers that define the overall what confidential computing is and go into a lot of detail about the different offerings that are out there. There's also details on the website about a lot of the different open source projects, because the Confidential Computing Consortium is part of the Linux Foundation, and open solutions are a big part of that effort. And so a lot more content available out on the website, and I encourage everybody to check that out as well as the full report. So Abhishek, thank you very much for your efforts in this space and for your insights into the opportunities in this market, and looking forward to working with you and talking to you more in the future.
Yeah, same here.
Well, thank you both very much for speaking today, and thank you all for joining this webinar. As I mentioned before, the slides and the recording from this presentation will be available shortly on YouTube and the Confidential Computing website. So stay tuned to see that, and thank you all again. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, thanks.
Bye, everyone.